Good morning. I am Kevin Price. Delighted to be with you. Going to spend some time talking to you about you and your business. And we got a lot to cover. We're going to be kind of all over the map on today's program, but it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm going to jump straight into it. Interesting article over the Wall Street Journal about nearly 6,000 federal inmates set to be released. You know, and there was a time not that long ago, Mr. Law and Order Kevin Price would have been really upset over what's taking place and the getting soft on crime and that type of thing. But I got to tell you, my positions are evolving over time, and I guess they've been buttressed with a little bit of reality. There's something wrong with the fact the United States has only about 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's prisoners. You know, and there's this old saying back in the old Soviet Union called 4 felonies a day. The typical Russian citizen, inadvertently, without even realizing it, usually went out and committed 4 felonies a day under Soviet law, just because there were so many laws. Well, our situation in this country is becoming very similar. We're all convicts waiting to happen. If a petty dictator somehow was able to figure out how to take over this country, he'd already have grounds to put all of us in jail and many of us for what would seem like indefinitely. And so, I'm interested in the conversation and adding to the conversation and looking at these different situations. Kevin Ring is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. We're going to talk a little bit about this upcoming release. He's also going to tell us a little bit about his organization. Kevin, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about the organization and what you guys are about.
Okay. Our name sort of gives us away, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. We oppose mandatory minimum sentences at the federal and state level. And for people who don't know, mandatory minimum sentences are laws that Congress or state legislatures pass that set a minimum prison term for certain offenses. And in doing so, they create a one-size-fits-all punishment that we would argue does not always fit the crime. And so in the drug context, for instance, legislators write laws that will say if you deal with 5 grams of a certain substance, you get 5 years in prison. That punishment may very well fit some offenders, a kingpin or others who are dealing in large amounts, but it doesn't fit everybody. And so sometimes you get these situations where a low-level offender who doesn't know who else is working for the same boss gets caught in a conspiracy charge where he's held accountable for what everybody else is doing, even though he doesn't know about it. And the kingpin, in order to save himself, takes a plea deal where he incriminates everybody else. And so the lowest level offender gets the longest sentence. This happens quite often. In fact, the drug mandatory minimum sentences are most often applied to couriers and mules and low-level offenders more than they are to kingpins. We think that's an unjust outcome. The result of it has been we have been locking up more and more nonviolent offenders for longer periods of time, and it's getting expensive, and it's not doing right by communities. And it's not making us safer because when people go away for that long period of time, they come out less likely to be able to rejoin society, find a job, and be productive.
Yeah, well, I think that, and I think there's certainly an attitude shift. You know, America's history, and I think probably the history of all countries, seems to go back and forth rather than finding, a third way that's balanced and makes sense. We tend to be reactionary, don't we? We operate in either too loosey-goosey rules about crime, about punishment rather, that led to wildly short sentences and a dangerous revolving door in the 80s, to a situation where it's become very petty and I think over litigious in our culture.
I think that's right.
It's kind of an interesting history.
There's a little bit of a false debate happening where people say, look, we passed these strict mandatory minimums in the 1980s and crime has fallen, and so those are the only 2 data points you need. And it ignores the fact that we just might have overshot a little bit. No one is arguing that prison has done nothing to help reduce crime. We're just saying that even the most conservative criminologists say that it's responsible for maybe 25% of the drop in crime. Well, that's 75% that's due to other factors, which we aren't exactly sure what they are. It might be policing. It may be changing demographics. We're not exactly sure. But what we do know is the rate of return on incarcerating people today is very low. And so you've seen a shift in attitudes, like you said, such that states are now starting to reduce their penalties for nonviolent offenders, and their crime rates are still going down, which shows that there isn't this sort of one-for-one connection. We're not finely tuning the system like we think we are.
Yeah, no question about it. So talk a little bit about some of your objectives. You've said, obviously, your name does reveal a lot, but kind of give us an example of where you're working and what you're doing.
Sure. Well, right now we have bills in Congress that would modestly but helpfully reduce mandatory penalties for, again, some lower-level nonviolent drug offenders, and allow judges to have more discretion in those cases so they can apply a punishment that fits the crime. One thing that we're out talking about now is this news story about the release of prisoners that's happening all at once, and it seems in some cases to be frightening people, thinking there's some kind of jailbreak going on. But that's been a very deliberate process that's been happening over the course of a year. Most of these folks are already back in the community in halfway houses or in home confinement, looking for work and rejoining their families. And it's again, and even that move is part of the larger effort to right-size sentences for nonviolent offenders. So frankly, we can use the funding that's being diverted for that purpose back to hiring cops, investigators, prosecutors, and in some cases, funding treatment programs for addicts, so that we can actually reduce crime. I mean, I think there used to be this debate about being hard on crime, soft on crime, all that sort of stuff. The truth is nobody wants crime, and we're just trying to figure out the best way to reduce crime. It isn't always locking up individual offenders for decades. Sometimes it's realizing that a 5-year sentence is fine so long as we treat the underlying reasons why that person was committing crime.
Yeah, we need to get sensible about crime is what we need to do. And we really need to, I think there's a strong case that can be made. I, for one, have gotten to the point, I like to see the federal government get out of the drug arena entirely, except for when it comes to international issues, international cartels coming in, and those type of issues. I'd like to see this brought down to the state levels. Let there be a melting pot of states or the laboratories that the founding fathers originally talked about, and let's see which best practices rises to the top, rather than a one-size-fit-all approach that has made drugs smuggling and drug dealing a massive enterprise in this country.
I think that's right, and I think even with marijuana, the states that have legalized marijuana, including recreational marijuana, I don't have strong feelings on that. I think it's a waste of federal resources to be going after marijuana offenders, but I don't know what the cultural impact is going to be of having legal marijuana. I don't know what that's going to do. You hear studies about its impact on kids' brains. I think there's things to worry about with it.
Yep.
But I think you're right that it's not a bad thing for a few states to go out there and let us get some data, let us see what their experience teaches us, and maybe it's a good model, maybe it's not. But we can't do it if we have a one-size-fits-all standard that applies to all 50 states.
And we both know that a lot of states are going to take a educational approach, a rehabilitation approach, and it'd be interesting to see how those rise to the top. I personally believe that prohibiting it only makes it more attractive. I just believe that. I fundamentally believe that that's how human nature works. And
you probably have a good argument if you look at tobacco.
Yeah, or alcohol.
Tobacco use is down incredibly, and we didn't outlaw that at all.
No, we just made it more sensible. We taken more sensible approaches, educational, and that type of thing. Meanwhile, we know from the great, we know during the booming 20s when alcohol was prohibited, it was all over the place, and of course, crime exploded as well. Right now, the only ones who want to keep the laws exactly like they are probably the head of the DEA and the head of the cartels.
Yes, and unfortunately, some in law enforcement. I mean, in their defense, they see a lot of cases of addiction. They see what addiction is doing to some of these communities, and it is a problem, but that's an education issue. The violence attends to the fact that it is illegal, and so you do get the black market trade, and so the violence comes with that. And so, I understand those who are worried about it, but what we're doing is not working. I mean, drug use is not down.
No question.
It's remained relatively flat, and so, it's not clear who we think we're helping.
We need to try a diversified approach We need to get those 50 laboratories like the Founding Fathers originally intended, experimenting and coming up with a way that ways that might work. I believe the best ways will rise to the top. Kevin Ring, he is with the Foundation Against Mandatory Minimums, and that is FAMM.org. Kevin, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you, though, you're listening to The Price of Business.